My name is Lenore Von Stein, and this is yet another episode of The Facts. And The Facts is a series of shows, art music shows and discussion shows mixed in together, one affecting the other in whatever way they do affect each other. And tonight we're going to talk about drugs. And sitting next to me is Tony Newman. He's the Director of Media Relations at the Drug Policy Alliance. And across the table is George Brandon. He's the Professor of Community Health and Social Medicine at the Sophie Davis School, which is at City College, part of the City University of New York. And we were, let's start. We were talking about what we were going to talk about, right? So let's talk about what is a drug, defining what a drug is.
Well, a drug is any substance that affects the structure or the functioning of the human body, other than food. You really have to define drugs in relationship to food, because food also affects the structure and function of the human body, but not in the same way. Also, there's another way in which we can differentiate drugs from food. That's in terms of a number of consequences or issues that come up regularly, such as addiction is an issue with a variety of drugs, or habituation, where you have to take more of the same drug to get the equivalent effect, or a psychological dependence, where your body really isn't dependent on the drug at all, but you're psychologically dependent on the drug's effects. So when we're looking at drugs, it's actually a very large terrain. It's a whole spectrum of drugs, and not only those that most usually come to people's mind when you use that word, which is those that are illegal. There are many drugs that are available to us, and that we use every day. It's part of getting through life.
So I'm reading Dostoevsky's The Gambler, and I'm a musician, and one of the things that over the years that the musicians, there's not as many as there were, but there were many musicians that I dealt with that had serious drug problems. And sometimes when those drug problems would wane, if they'd lived through them, if they were in their 50s and they'd lived through them, they might turn to gambling. So gambling's not a drug because it doesn't, although it has a lot of the same qualities to it in terms of addictive behavior, habituate. I have to go to the track, or I have to go to OTB, or whatever it is.
Well, gambling's a behavior.
Gambling is a behavior.
It's not a substance.
Okay. So these substances, these opiates, and these, let's just talk about some of these, okay? The opiates and well, I mean, why are some drugs legal and some drugs illegal?
Well, I think Tony can deal with that much better than I do.
Yeah, it's funny. We, as George has said, hold on.
A little mic lapse.
Sorry about that. When, as George mentioned, is an interesting thing. When we hear the word drugs, first thing that pops into people's head often, is marijuana, cocaine, the illicit drugs. But as George mentioned, I mean, drugs are all around us, from coffee to cigarettes to Viagra, Prozac, Ritalin. Why a certain drug is illegal and illegal is not based on any kind of rational science. We have cigarettes and alcohol, which are legal, which leads to 400,000 premature deaths every year, which is cigarettes, and marijuana, which is illegal, which no one has ever died from overdosing on marijuana or from marijuana use. So it's totally random which drugs are legal, which ones are illegal. If you look at the history of when the first marijuana laws became illegal, it was targeted towards the Mexicans and people on the border. It was a way to go after the Mexicans. When the opium first became illegal, it was toward the Chinese, and even though white women were using opium before, it's when Chinese started using it. The first anti-cocaine laws were targeted towards blacks in the 30s. So what we normally see is that when you make something illegal, a lot of times it's this is the 40th anniversary of Richard Nixon declaring the war on drugs. It was the 40th anniversary, and there's a famous quote when Richard Nixon was talking to his chief of staff, and he said, "We have to figure out how to blame the blacks without looking like we're blaming the blacks." And a lot of times when you look at how our drug laws are enforced, it's a way to not say we're going out, it's not discriminate, we're just going after drugs. But a lot of times our drug laws, time and time again, have racist connotation with it.
So in a way, the use of drugs is a way to escape from the society that would make such laws. It's a way to escape from or one of the reasons to use drugs. Although as I understand it, this is more people of color go to jail for drugs, but the statistics are that more people that are white use drugs.
I mean, everyone in our society is using drugs. I mean, how many people of our viewers, like I mentioned, when you think of the spectrum of legal and illegal, basically everyone's using drugs, but only certain people are going to jail for it. You look in New York, 90% of the people in jail in behind bars are black and Latino. Marijuana, everyone knows that white people smoke marijuana as much as black and Latinos. Here in New York, 86% of the people who are getting arrested are black and Latino, even though white people smoke all the time. And why is that? It's because who the cops are stopping and searching. If you search any university, you search the Upper East Side, you're going to find people with weed. But if you're searching only certain neighborhoods and you're stopping and frisking only black and brown people, then that's how you're going to find it. So we have a city like New York, Mayor Bloomberg's famous quote, "I smoked marijuana and I liked it." But here he is, 87% of the people. And here's the other irony, is that under an ounce of marijuana in New York is actually not even an arrestable offense. It's supposed to be an infraction. The only exception is if you're smoking it in public, or if it's out in public, or it's burning in public. So what the cops do is they go and they search mostly young kids, young black and Latino kids. They say, "What are you holding in your pocket? Show me and I'll make it easier for you." The kid pulls out the marijuana. Now it's in public view, and they arrest them. So they arrest 50,000 people a year when it's not even supposed to be an arrestable offense. And once you get arrested, you can lose financial aid, you can get kicked out of public housing, you can lose benefits. So there's all these collateral consequences that most of New York doesn't even know about. They don't know about these 50,000 arrests. We just put out a report at the Drug Policy Alliance. We spent $75 million on these marijuana arrests. And think about this time where they're cutting the schools and the libraries and all these cuts to our society, and we're spending $75 million searching in kids' pockets to arrest them and get them in the criminal justice system when. And you know what? It has no impact on marijuana. That's the other thing.
So why? And I'm not playing the devil's advocate here, but why just why are we doing it? It's not, and I'm not, it's not, and it's not just the arrest, right? It's the amount of time that those kids are going to spend in jail. The white kid, middle class kid gets arrested for the same thing. That it's a much easier go. The terrible things that happen to people in jails, plus what happens to you when you get out of jail. But I mean, this is in a way a step away from the discussion about drugs. Why on the deep political, whatever level it is, are we doing this? Does the government do this? I mean, is it just a scapegoat of the millennium or something? Scapegoat of the century? That a way to take the heat off something else? I mean, it's such a nefarious activity.
Well, it's not a single motive. And in fact, if you go back and look at certain things, you can see that some of the emphasis has changed over time. You were talking earlier about musicians who were involved with drugs. I mean, basically, from the 30s through, like the mid-60s, there was a sort of a heroin cult within the jazz world,
yes,
basically. But part of that was, the situations that they were in.
Yes.
The life that they were living. Part of it was symbolic. Was them setting themselves aside as a special group with a subculture of its own. And so in order to get into certain cliques, you basically had to use. I was around a lot of jazz musicians, particularly at the end of that era, because it really began to shift in the mid-60s. Mm-hmm. So by the time I was involved with, with these folks, there was a serious divide between younger musicians and older ones in terms of how they looked at this stuff. But for the older ones, it was part of a whole subculture that they were in, which is part of, the fast life. They were the swift folks who move and groove through all the circles, and looked at other people as being basically, squares.
I want to from the perspective of having being a musician and having worked with a lot of those people, studied with those people. One of the other it's very hard to get up on a stage. It's hard to, and it's hard to. I mean, I worked, and I don't want to mention any name. I remember working with a guy. I couldn't believe everything he was doing in the bathroom. I didn't understand how he was going to sit at the piano, you know. But it's this range of things that you deny, you know, that aside from oh yeah, you know, whatever hip in this macho world of jazz, which is really hard to be a full human being in, and not just for women, for men too, and so medicating yourself with this stuff that relieves. I used to get up on the stage stoned, and it ruins your time as well as your voice, but it's easier to handle the way the audience, you know, you're really not a person to them, and your bandmates who were, you know, competitive. It's not a nice world, you know. So it's a way to it was a way for me, and I thought for many of them it was a way to relieve this. And for many musicians, for instance, they started using when they were very young. You know, I'm out on the road when I'm 14 or 15 years old with these guys. I got to find a way to live through this. I'm playing in these funny places with these doors that open, and I don't know what's going on behind these, you know, these in these nightclubs. And it's, you know, aside from whatever kinds of other burdens you're carrying with you. And I guess, you know, it goes. I just want to. It goes back to this issue of how sophisticated you are about what it is that you're using and what it's doing, and the propaganda, this blanket of ignorance that's just thrown over everything, making it so difficult for you to discern the trees from the trees.
Right.
You know, it's funny. You talk about the drug use and musicians, and I mean, one of the things that is important to remember is that, you know, people use drugs for pleasure and for some creativity. A lot of people like to either play music or write, or maybe it helps them overcome some of their fear. If you're a stand-up comic, I can imagine, or even if you're a dancer, you know, there's times whenever we want to go out and dance, how many times do you have a couple of drinks before you go out dancing? So people use drugs in those ways. And there's also, like you said, a lot of drug use is self-medicating and pain, and so it's an important thing to remember that drug use is both for joy and for pain, and a lot of us have used drugs for both those reasons. One thing very quickly, when you ask why would we ever do things like this, you know, I think it's very easy for politicians to, you know, they want to look, especially, you know, what's sad is that Democrats have been just as bad enforcing and coming up with this war on drugs as Republicans. They've been just as bad. And you know, because for Democrats, a lot of times it's like, it's a way they can be tough on crime. I want to look good. It's easy, you know. So, you know, even Bill Clinton did terrible things around, you know, these things about kicking people out of public housing or losing your benefits. That was under Bill Clinton. This idea that you can't use clean syringes to reduce HIV. Clinton never lifted that. So the politicians, a lot of times it's a way to look, you know, get your tough on crime kind of credentials, and a lot of times they, you know, they haven't had to, you know, they haven't cared about so many people incarcerated. And I think now we're reaching a point where so many states can't afford. You know, we used to have 50,000 people incarcerated on drug charges in 1980. Now we have 500,000 people. So, you know, it's not, hasn't always been this way. But now states can't afford $50,000 to put someone in a cage because they have a substance abuse problem. And so I think slowly elected officials are starting to say we need, you know, even conservative states are starting to say maybe we need to offer treatment instead of incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, there's an economic aspect to that as well, which was, you know, basically the private prison industry, which was easier to feed when state coffers were full. But now that all the states are, you know, feeling the results of the recession and have to pull back, you have something like Cuomo talking about closing some prisons in New York State. That would have been unheard of, you know, 5 or 6 years ago. He's actually talking about doing that now.
So they're not, prisons aren't the money-making machines?
No, they still are, but you got to pay them. You got to put money into that.
You got to put money into that's vigorous. You got to put money into it to get the money out of it that you're making off these people.
Well, a lot of the prison services are privately run. You know, so basically, you know, you're outsourcing that whole function, which is basically a caging function. It's not really about rehabilitation. You know, and it gets to the point where you realize that you can't afford to do that to the degree that you were before. which is basically what Cuomo is realizing.
So he can't pay that private sector kitty anymore the way he was with our tax money.
No, so he's going to close some of them. He's going to close some of them. Of course, the thing is, all these folks are going to get out, and then what?
Yes, and then what? And then what? I work with nonprofits too, writing. I was working with one in East New York, which is one of the, there's 5 places in New York that most people go to jail from, five neighborhoods, and it's one of those. And working on an educational program for people coming out of jail. Oh my goodness gracious, I mean, coming out of school is bad enough, coming out of these lousy schools, coming out of jail with whatever level of untreated post-traumatic stress. I mean, how can you not have post-traumatic stress coming out of jail? And whatever else happened to you there, and then all the things they ask you to pay back, right? They ask you to pay back for the drug test. They ask you to pay back for the probation officer. These gentlemen know. Maybe people in the audience don't know it. Sometimes when I tell my students, they what they ask you to pay back all this stuff. So you're always.
And there's a lot of barriers once you get out. You go look how hard it is to get jobs and for people who are unemployed right now in general. But imagine you get out of jail and right at the top of the application, have you ever been convicted of a felony? First question right there, right? And then there's certain jobs you can't even get into. The laws are so crazy, like you can't be in a salon, you can't work in a salon if you had a former felon. So there's these crazy barriers that are set up for people. And then they say, oh, you can't go in certain housing, you can't go here, and you can't. There's so many barriers, and then we wonder why there's so much recidivism. If you come out and you have no job, and we're setting up all these barriers for people to be able to re-enter society, and then we wonder why so many people end up going back to jail.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's a situation in which you were, disadvantaged to begin with, which is how you managed to get arrested. Then you go to jail and let you out, and you're even more disadvantaged than before because of all the other barriers that you have, because now you're an ex-convict.
So these are some of the effects, is one of my questions on here. These are some of the effects of the war on drugs, is a disenfranchising of whole groups of people that were a little less disenfranchised before this happened,
right. Now they're more so.
How dangerous are these substances, some of these drugs that are, that they can put you in the who's gal for? We know marijuana is probably not all that dangerous, although it may be dangerous at certain points in brain development or not.
And I think if you look at marijuana compared to the range of drugs that are out there, I think it's undeniably safer than so many other drugs out there, including alcohol, prescription drugs. I mean, right now, when you ask about how dangerous drugs are, the second leading cause of preventable death in this country right now is overdose deaths. And a lot of, in the past, where it may have been heroin you associated with it, now it's these prescription pills. So, 20,000 people die in a year from overdoses. So obviously there's some danger there. But look at how our drug policy works, where it's almost opposed to being healthy. Most people that are overdosing are with another friend when they're doing it. If you call 911, that person will most likely live. But people don't call 911 because they're afraid the cops are going to come and arrest people. So our laws are set up where, so that's one of the things we try to pass legislation saying it should never be a crime to call 911 to save someone's life. And we passed in one state, New Mexico. It's also passed in Washington State. But that should be around the country. You should always be able to call 911. So there are some dangers, especially with prescription drugs right now. We see things with alcohol. Again, 100,000 people prematurely die from alcohol. With cigarettes, again, the problem. But the thing is, it's the balance. It's always the thing to remember. Even though there's no drug is not safe or unsafe. It's how you use it. It's what your relationship with it is. You can die from overdosing on alcohol, or you can drink every night of your life and have a totally healthy life. So it's important to realize drugs are not good or bad, safe, or you can have an unhealthy relationship. With food, no. With the marijuana, alcohol, cigarettes, prescription drugs, you have an unhealthy relationship, or you can have a healthy relationship with those drugs also.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to keep in mind is people often talk as if when people use drugs, the only thing that's there is the drug. But the characteristics of the whole effect that all has relates to, first the pharmacological properties of the drug, but also, the properties of the person that's taking it, as well as the person that they're getting it from, and in the context in which they're taking it. All these things affect what happens. I remember, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. In terms of drugs that looking at the kind of danger the different drugs might have. I mean, there are regular drugs that are regularly prescribed that are known to be addictive. They're known to be addictive. And people may be on them for years, partly because they really need them to deal with the pain. A lot of them are painkillers, like Oxycontin is like that. It's an opiate. It's addictive. You take it for long enough, you're going to be addicted to it. And but that's acceptable because the alternative is this excruciating pain that the person has, and of course it's under societal control because it's only legally you can get it from a doctor. But you have other kinds of situation where, in effect, the person is taking the drug and getting nothing from it. When the person is taking...
what do you mean a person is taking the drug and
I'll
getting nothing?
give an example, okay? There's a lot of, the most frequently prescribed drugs are psychotropic drugs. They're mood-altering drugs. They're things like things take to get to sleep. They're tranquilizers. These are the most prescribed drugs, okay? And a person could be on a tranquilizer for years because they're taken, on a regular basis. You can be taking them two or 3 years. Okay. When you begin to look at what's happening physiologically with that, over the course of time, stuff is not even being taken up anymore. Physiologically, it ceases to have an effect, but people are still taking them.
So it's like a placebo
It's
at that
a
point.
psychological dependence on the drug.
Like Valium or something like that?
Valium, Mellaril are good examples of that. They're very frequently prescribed in this kind of case. Well, a lot of times the doctor doesn't know because the doctor is dependent on the patient telling them what their sensations are.
So the doctor has no way to measure it?
No. All he has is the patient's report. And so there are people who are taking these drugs for years and years and years, and it's no longer having any physiological effect on them. They develop a dependence on the act of taking the drug.
Is this kind of, pharmacology is how new is it? I mean, is this a 20th century phenomenon? I mean, I know that people have always taken drugs, but the range of drugs, the range of points in your mind that they can hit, like points on your palate, this is a modern phenomenon, is it not? Or is it?
Oh, it's definitely increased since you began to be able to synthesize drugs. I mean, that goes back to really the 1870s, 1880s. It became possible to synthesize drugs or sort of analyze to naturally occurring drugs. And then after that, to be able to concoct drugs, to synthesize drugs that don't exist in nature. I mean, now it's gotten to the point where there are people who are called basically computational chemists. And essentially what they're able to do is to synthesize a variety of drugs for which the uses are unknown. They're able to make them because they can. Hopefully, the hope is that if they know enough about the way certain compounds react with each other, they can target them, but they don't always know. So it becomes sort of a shell game. So it's just gotten wider and wider and wider. To the point where you have drugs that are being used not to treat an illness of any kind or to allay pain, but are taken to augment abilities, to make you smarter. Or to deal with something that may or may not.
Viagra.
Well, that's a good example. Viagra was originally developed to treat angina. It wasn't to develop for erectile dysfunction at all. But that's how they've been able to sell it.
It's funny, you asked about is this something that's been going on for, and drugs have been around for 1,000 years, and they'll be around for 1,000 more, and it's so interesting, you get these politicians always stand up and say, we're going to be a drug-free world by 10 years. They really do make these declarations where, Partnership for a Drug-Free America or these, groups that are out there. And so 40 years after Nixon launched this war, we've spent $1 trillion trying to get rid of drugs. We've locked up millions of our fellow citizens in cages over it, And you know what? Drugs are just as available as ever before. And the one point I do also want to make is that there's harms that come from drugs, whether it's overdose or alcoholism and all that stuff. And then there's problems that come from prohibition. And when alcohol was illegal, you had Al Capone and shootouts in the streets and all that stuff. No one today is dying over Budweiser sales and shooting each other over Budweiser.
Yes.
And
yes.
right now in Mexico, you see on the front page every day, there's been 35,000 killings in the last 4 years in Mexico, and that has nothing to do with the marijuana plant or the coca plant. It's because it's illegal, that those plants are worth more than gold, that people will kill each other over the right to sell it. So it's like we talk about the harms and how drugs impact people, but we also have to look at what prohibition does. When you say something is not allowed to be used and we will keep it off the street, it doesn't work. People still drank during alcohol prohibition. People still smoke marijuana now. But you know, in addition to the health facts, we have killings and violence. Most violence you read about in the paper in our communities, if you look, it has something to do with the drug prohibition. And as cigarettes are a very unhealthy drug, right now now we're getting more and more hysteria around cigarettes. And you can't smoke outdoors, you can't smoke at beaches, you can't smoke here, you can't smoke in your house. You know, we're going to ban menthol cigarettes. By the logic of prohibition, you should make cigarettes illegal. They're much more dangerous than other ones. But you know what would happen if you made cigarettes illegal? It'd be just like the crack wars before. People would still smoke cigarettes, but you'd have shootouts in the streets over people trying to get them. And people who can't quit would end up going to fill jail cells because they can't quit their nicotine habit. So we have to treat drugs and the health thing, but not be so foolish to think that if you make it illegal, it's going to get rid of the problem.
This is, we're heading. He's giving me the 1 minute mark. So we've got to wind this up, and we're going to be talking some more, but we're going to wind up this conversation. I always have a problem. I don't know how long a minute is, or I don't even know how long 10 seconds is. But, well, I know 10 seconds. So we talked about the war on drugs. We talked about stress and drugs. Is there any final, in these last, what must be 50 seconds, that that we can, well, I'll just say something. You know, a world that is, I don't want a drug-free world. I want a world that is free of worrying about worrying about the knock on the door, worrying about being hurt for and not getting help for when you become addicted to something, and here we are, and that's something like that. We can get